The chamber of the Grand Assembly on Thessinus Prime had never known true silence, not once in its 10,000 years of existence, not when empires crumbled, not when stars died, not when entire species vanished from the galactic record. But on that day, in the year 2387 by the human calendar, silence arrived like an uninvited guest and sat down in the center of the room and refused to leave. Ambassador Lyra Osai stood at the speaking platform, the smallest figure in a hall built for giants, her dark skin catching the pale blue light that poured from the crystalline ceiling far above her head, and she looked out at the 42 delegations of the Galactic Council with an expression that none of them could read, because none of them had ever bothered to learn how human faces worked. She wore no ceremonial armor, carried no staff of office, displayed none of the glittering badges that other species draped across themselves like shields against irrelevance, and her hands rested calmly at her sides as if she were standing in a garden back on Earth rather than in the most powerful room in the known galaxy. The Sithari delegation sat in the upper tiers, their scaled bodies gleaming like polished bronze, their long necks craning forward with the lazy interest of predators watching something too small to eat. And Counselor Valith Tharan, the eldest among them, tapped one clawed finger against the armrest of his seat in a slow rhythm that everyone in the chamber recognized as boredom. The Oravon cluster occupied the far left, their translucent forms shimmering with the soft internal light of a species that communicated through thought as much as sound, and among them sat Counselor Iluni, whose ancient mind had witnessed more than 4,000 years of galactic politics, and who noticed, though she could not yet explain why, that something about the human ambassador felt different today. The Velisi floated in their sealed water pods near the back, their tentacles pressed against the glass in polite attention, and the Drith Collective buzzed softly in their hive section, a low hum that was their version of respectful quiet, and the Kithvori, tall, fragile, bird-like, perched on their high seats with their enormous dark eyes fixed on the small woman below. Lyra Ose opened her mouth and spoke 12 words. Humanity thanks the Council for its centuries of instruction. We take our leave. She did not raise her voice, did not pause for dramatic effect, did not scan the room for reactions, and when the 12 words were finished, she simply stepped back from the platform and walked toward the exit with the steady, unhurried stride of someone who had made a decision long before this moment and had no intention of unmade it. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then Valith Tharan let out a sound that was the Sithari equivalent of a laugh, a sharp hiss followed by a clicking of teeth, and he leaned toward the delegate beside him and said loudly enough for the entire chamber to hear, "The infant species throws a tantrum. How delightful. Shall we note it in the minutes or simply let it pass like wind through an open door?" Laughter rippled through the upper tiers, the kind of laughter that comes not from joy, but from the desperate need to believe that nothing important is happening. But Iluni did not laugh, and in the silence of her ancient mind, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, a cold thread of unease winding through her thoughts like a crack spreading through ice. Within 72 standard hours, every human in Council space was gone. Not fleeing, not scrambling, not leaving in the frantic chaos of a species under threat. No, they left the way a river leaves a valley when the dam is opened somewhere upstream, steadily and completely, and with the terrifying calm of something that had been planned for a very long time. On the ocean world of Velisi Prime, the human engineers who had maintained the deepwater filtration systems for 3 generations packed their tools, uploaded their final maintenance reports to the local servers, and walked to their ships without looking back. And the Velisi who watched them go from behind the glass walls of their underwater cities felt a strange tightness in their gills that they did not yet understand. On the 12 agricultural colonies of the Drith Collective, human botanists and soil specialists closed their greenhouses, labeled every seed container, left detailed instructions written in the Drith language, and boarded transport vessels that lifted silently into the gray skies. And the Drith workers who had shared meals with them for decades stood in the empty fields and buzzed a frequency that meant confusion and loss. On Thessanis Prime itself, human doctors in the cross-species medical wing finished their shifts, handed their patient files to colleagues who barely knew how to read them, and removed the name badges from their coats and placed them in a neat row on the front desk like soldiers laying down their weapons. And the hallways that had always smelled of human coffee and the sound of human laughter went quiet in a way that made the walls feel closer. Trade routes emptied, communication channels closed with a soft electronic click that sounded somehow final. Human-built relay stations powered down one by one across the spiral arm like candles being blown out in a vast dark cathedral. And the galaxy that had grown so used to the background hum of human activity suddenly found itself listening to a silence it did not know how to fill. The council convened an emergency session, not because they were worried, they assured each other, but simply to address the administrative inconvenience of a member species departing without proper procedure. Valith Tharan dominated the session with the easy confidence of someone who had never once in his long life been proven wrong about anything that mattered. And he stood at the same platform where Lyra Osa had spoken her 12 words and delivered a speech that lasted 45 minutes and contained not a single sentence of substance. "Let them go," he said, his voice carrying the deep resonance that made Sithari oratory so impressive and so empty. "The galaxy turned before humanity arrived, and it will turn long after they are forgotten. They were useful in their small ways. Yes, as a work animal is useful, but we are not diminished by the loss of a work animal. We simply find another." The chamber applauded, because applause was easier than thought. A vote was called to seal humanity's records and ban public discussion of their departure, treating it as a bureaucratic footnote rather than a historical event. And the vote passed unanimously, 41 species raising their various limbs and tentacles and light signals in agreement. And Valith Tharan produced a bottle of ether wine, the pale golden drink reserved for celebrations of council unity, and poured glasses for the senior delegates. They drank and they laughed, and they told each other that nothing had changed. Only Iluni abstained from the toast, and when a colleague asked her why, she said something that would haunt the council for years to come. "I am old enough to know the difference between a door closing and a trap being set, and I am not yet certain which sound we just heard." Nobody listened to her, because nobody ever listened to warnings that required them to feel uncomfortable. And the session ended with handshakes and diplomatic pleasantries, and the satisfied hum of a governing body that believed it had handled a minor disruption with appropriate grace. Outside the windows of Thessanis Prime, the last human ship, a small, unremarkable transport vessel with no name painted on its hull, crossed the outer marker buoy and jumped to faster-than-light speed. And the brief flash of light it left behind faded so quickly that anyone watching might have mistaken it for a star blinking just once before going dark. The galaxy held its breath, though it did not yet know why. And somewhere beyond the rim, in a direction no council map had ever bothered to chart, Lyra Os sat in the captain's chair of that unnamed ship and looked at the stars ahead of her and allowed herself, for the first time in 30 years of diplomatic service, to exhale. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing anymore. 6 months after the last human ship vanished beyond the rim, the ocean world of Velisi Prime sent its first distress signal in 400 years, and the sound of it, a deep, keening wail broadcast on every emergency frequency, echoed through council space like the cry of something drowning in the dark. The filtration systems were failing. Not all at once, not in the dramatic fashion of an explosion or a catastrophic malfunction, but slowly, quietly. In the way that complex things die when the hands that understood them are no longer there to keep them alive. And the Velisi, who had spent centuries swimming through water so clean it was almost invisible, began to notice a faint brown tinge creeping into the currents around their deepest cities. Toxin levels rose by 2% in the first week, then 5, then 9, and the Velocity engineers who examined the filtration cores found themselves staring at technology they could identify but not comprehend, because the systems had been designed by human minds that thought in ways no aquatic species had ever needed to think, layered and redundant and impossibly elegant in their simplicity, and without the humans who had built them. The machines were nothing more than beautiful puzzles with no solution. The Velocity Communion sent a formal petition to the Council, requesting emergency technical assistance, and the Council, still riding the comfortable wave of its own denial, assigned a team of Sithari engineers to the problem, because the Sithari were the oldest technological civilization in Council space, and surely they could fix a few water filters. The Sithari engineers arrived on Velocity Prime with the arrogance of surgeons asked to apply a bandage, and they left 3 weeks later with the haunted expressions of children who had opened a door and found the ocean behind it, because the filtration systems were not just filters. They were an interconnected network of biological and mechanical processes so deeply integrated into the planet's ecosystem that removing one component would collapse the entire chain. And the humans who had designed them had left no manual, because the manual was in their heads, and their heads were gone. On the 12 colony worlds of the Drith Collective, the crops were dying. The Drith had not known, had never been told, had never thought to ask, that their entire agricultural system was built on a foundation of human-engineered hybrid seeds, genetic lines carefully crafted over generations to thrive in the specific soil chemistry of each world, and the seed rotation schedules that kept the harvests coming year after year had been maintained by human botanists who treated the work not as a job, but as a calling. Without the rotations, the soil began to exhaust itself, and without the hybrid seeds, the replacement crops failed to take root, and the Drith, a hive species that measured wealth in food and measured panic in silence, went quiet across 12 worlds in a way that terrified their neighbors more than any scream could have. Famine was not a word the Drith used lightly, because famine for a hive species did not mean hunger. It meant the slow death of entire genetic lines, the withering of queens, the collapse of social structures that had taken millennia to build, and as the grain stores emptied and the larvae began to starve, the Drith Collective sent a message to the Council that contained only 4 words: "We are becoming less." The medical crises arrived next, not as a single wave, but as a rising tide that touched every shore. Humanity had been running over 40% of the galaxy's cross-species medical research, a number that no one had tracked because no one had wanted to know how dependent they were on the species they treated as lesser. And when the human researchers left, they took with them not just their knowledge but their ongoing work, the half-finished cures, the experimental treatments, the delicate clinical trials that required years of continuous observation. The Kithvori were the first to feel the full weight of this absence, because the Kithvori were a species that lived for thousands of years but were as fragile as glass, and the plague that had nearly destroyed them 2 centuries ago, a disease called the gray wasting that dissolved their hollow bones from the inside, had been defeated only by a human-developed antiviral that required constant refinement as the virus mutated. And without the human virologists who had dedicated their careers to keeping the Kithvori alive, the gray wasting returned like a patient predator that had simply been waiting for the guards to leave. Kithvori elders, beings who had watched stars form and die, began to collapse in their tower cities, their bones turning to powder inside their skin, and the sound of their falling was like the sound of dry branches breaking in a forest that had forgotten how to grow. The Navian trade corridor, the economic backbone of the entire galactic East, collapsed in a matter of weeks, because the corridor had functioned not on the strength of any single species' navy or treasury, but on the trust that human brokers had built over centuries, a web of handshake agreements and personal relationships and quiet guarantees that had kept ancient enemies trading instead of fighting. and without the humans standing in the middle with their impossible talent for making two sides believe they were both getting the better deal. The old hatreds resurfaced like bones rising from shallow graves. The Tenori accused the Velasi of hoarding water purification technology. The Velasi accused the Drith of withholding food shipments. The Drith accused the Sithari of stealing agricultural patents. And within 6 months, the most prosperous trade route in the galaxy was a graveyard of empty shipping lanes and abandoned stations where human coffee shops had once served drinks to species that would never have sat in the same room without a human smiling behind the counter. Counselor Iluni watched all of this from her chambers on Thessanis Prime, and with each new crisis report that crossed her desk, the thread of unease she had felt on the day of humanity's departure pulled tighter and tighter until it felt less like a thread and more like a noose. She began to pull old records, not the sealed files, not yet, but the public ones, the ones anyone could have read if anyone had cared to look. And what she found in those records kept her awake for 3 consecutive nights. Humanity had not infiltrated the galaxy systems through any scheme or strategy. They had simply volunteered, over and over and over, for every job that needed doing and nobody else wanted to do. The unglamorous work, the invisible work, the work that held everything together the way bones hold a body upright. And they had done it so quietly and so consistently that the galaxy had stopped noticing they were doing it at all, the way a person stops noticing their own heartbeat until it stops. She brought her concerns to the council, speaking carefully, choosing her words the way a surgeon chooses a blade, and she told them that the problems were not isolated, that they were connected, that humanity had been the connective tissue of their entire civilization, and that without them the body was beginning to fail. Valith Tharan listened to her with the patient expression of someone waiting for a child to finish speaking, and when she was done, he stood and addressed the chamber with the easy confidence that had carried him through 1,000 debates, and said that the solution was simple. They would build automated systems to replace every function humanity had served. Machines did not leave. Machines did not have feelings. Machines were better than humans in every measurable way. The project was approved within the hour and funded with enough credits to build a small moon. It failed within 3 weeks because the problem was never about machines. The problem was about trust and understanding, and the 10,000 small acts of kindness and patience that no algorithm could replicate. And the automated systems that were meant to replace human mediators started 3 new trade disputes. The medical AIs misdiagnosed 11 species because their databases lacked the human intuition that had filled the gaps between data points. And the agricultural drones planted the wrong seeds on 4 Drith worlds because no one had programmed them with the knowledge that human botanists carried in their hands like second nature. Valith Tharan blamed the engineers, and the engineers blamed the specifications, and the specifications blamed the data, and the data blamed the absence of the people who had gathered it, and the circle of blame spun faster and faster like a wheel with no axle until it flew apart and left nothing behind but silence. And in that silence, Iluni made a decision that would change everything. She would open the sealed records. She would find out what the council had really done to humanity. And she would make them look at it, every last one of them, whether they wanted to or not. Iluni broke the seal on a cold night, alone in the deep archives beneath Thessanis Prime. Surrounded by the hum of data cores that had not been accessed in 6 months, and the faint smell of dust that had no business existing on a space station, but somehow always found its way into forgotten places. The records opened like a wound. 300 years of humanity's membership in the Galactic Council unfolded across her screens in a cascade of documents, reports, petitions, memos, transcripts, and personal correspondences. And as Iluni read hour after hour, her translucent body dimming as her energy drained and her mind filled with things she could not unfeel, she began to understand that the story the Council had told itself about humanity was not just incomplete. It was a lie. The first files were administrative, dry and bureaucratic, the kind of paperwork that nobody reads because it is designed to be ignored, and buried in those files was the record of the Council's very first vote regarding humanity's status. A vote taken in the year 2091, just 4 years after first contact, in which 41 species unanimously decided that humans would be granted provisional membership with no voting rights, no territorial protections, and no seat on any committee that mattered. The justification, written in the elegant formal script of the Sithari legal tradition, stated that humanity was a nascent species of limited cognitive sophistication, whose cultural output does not meet the minimum threshold for full participation in galactic governance, and that granting them equal status would dilute the intellectual integrity of the Council's deliberative process. Humans were allowed to attend sessions, allowed to speak when spoken to, allowed to contribute labor and resources and ideas, but not allowed to vote, not allowed to own permanent territory, not allowed to hold any position above the rank of auxiliary consultant, a title that Iluni now realized was a polite way of saying servant. And humanity had accepted these terms, not because they believed them to be fair, but because they believed that fairness would come with time, that if they worked hard enough and gave enough and proved themselves enough, the Council would eventually see them as equals. They waited 200 years. 200 years of building, healing, teaching, feeding, mediating, cleaning, researching, volunteering, sacrificing, 200 years of doing the work that no elder species would touch, the dangerous work, the dirty work, the invisible work that held the galaxy together. And at the end of those 200 years, humanity filed its first formal petition for full membership and voting rights. The petition was denied in 11 minutes. Iluni found the transcript of that session and read it 3 times because she could not believe what she was seeing. 11 minutes to dismiss a species that had given 2 centuries of service. 11 minutes of discussion that consisted mostly of Valith Tharan's predecessor making jokes about human lifespans, and the Drith delegate buzzing in what the transcript noted was amusement. The petition was filed again 14 years later, and again it was denied, and again, and again, and again 47 times over the next century, each time with less discussion and more contempt, until the final denial was delivered not even in a formal session, but in a memo stamped with a single word that translated roughly to noted. But the voting rights were only the beginning. Iluni scrolled deeper and found the relocation orders, 17 in total, spanning 250 years, each one directing human colonies to abandon their established worlds and move to new locations to make room for elder species expansion. And each order was accompanied by a compensation assessment that valued human infrastructure at roughly 1/10 of its actual worth, meaning that every time humans built something beautiful and lasting, the Council took it from them and paid them barely enough to start over. She found the cultural suppression directives, formal Council resolutions that classified human music, art, literature, and religious practice as primitive cultural noise, and banned their display in public spaces on all Council stations, meaning that humans who lived and worked on Thessanis Prime and dozens of other shared installations were forbidden from singing their songs or hanging their paintings or celebrating their holidays where anyone else might see them. She found the peacekeeping assignments, a pattern so clear and so cruel that it made her ancient mind ache with shame, because the records showed that humans were assigned to the most dangerous conflict zones at a rate 400% higher than any other species. And when she cross-referenced the casualty reports, she found that more humans had died in Council peacekeeping operations than all other species combined. And not once, not a single time in 300 years, had the Council held a memorial or acknowledged the dead. She found the record of the Cascade Drive. This was the one that made her stop reading and sit in the dark for a long time. In the year 2298, a team of human physicists working in a small laboratory on a colony world that the Council had already scheduled for relocation developed a revolutionary faster-than-light propulsion system that was cheaper, cleaner, and 3 times faster than anything in existence. A breakthrough that would have reshaped galactic travel and made its inventors the most celebrated scientists in history. The Council seized the patents within a week, classified the research as a Council asset developed using Council resources, despite the fact that the laboratory had been entirely self-funded, awarded credit for the invention to a Sithari research institute that had contributed nothing, and then, in a final act of breathtaking cruelty, barred humans from using their own technology for 50 years, citing safety concerns regarding the operation of advanced systems by provisional member species. The human physicists filed a complaint, and the complaint was filed alongside 4,611 others in a database that Iluni now realized had been specifically designed to receive complaints and do absolutely nothing with them. A bureaucratic black hole that gave the illusion of justice while delivering none. She read all 4,612 complaints, every single one, and what struck her was not the anger in them. There was remarkably little anger, but the hope, the stubborn, heartbreaking, irrational hope that threaded through every document like a vein of gold and stone, the belief that if they just explained clearly enough, if they just documented thoroughly enough, if they just asked politely enough, someone would listen. No one ever did. At the very bottom of the archive, filed on the day before the departure, Iluni found a letter. It was written by Ambassador Lyra Osai, addressed to no one in particular and everyone in general, and it was the calmest, most measured, most devastating piece of writing Iluni had ever encountered in 4,000 years of life. The letter did not accuse, did not rage, did not threaten, did not plead. It simply laid out the facts, one after another, in the plain and simple language that humans used when they had moved beyond emotion into something harder and more permanent. And it ended with a single paragraph that Iluni would carry in her mind for the rest of her very long life. We asked to be treated as equals, and you taught us we never would be, so we will go somewhere we do not have to ask. We bear you no anger, because anger would mean we still believed you might change, and we have stopped believing that. We wish you well, not because you deserve it, but because choosing kindness even when it is not deserved is what makes us who we are, and we will not let you take that from us too. Iluni copied every file, every record, every complaint, every memo, every relocation order, every suppression directive, every casualty report, and she carried them into the Grand Assembly the next morning and projected them onto every screen in the chamber, and said 5 words that cracked the council like a hammer striking glass. This is what we did. The chamber erupted. The Velasi delegation demanded to know why they had not been told, and the Drith collective buzzed at a frequency that meant fury and grief simultaneously, and the Kethvari, who were already dying of a plague that humans had once kept at bay, made a sound that no translator could process because it was not a word but a wail. 3 species announced their immediate withdrawal from the council before the session was an hour old, their delegates walking out with the rigid movements of people who could not bear to be in the room any longer. Valith Tharan sat in his seat and watched the chaos with the expression of a predator who had been cornered. And when Iluni turned to him and asked him directly, in front of every remaining delegation, whether he had known, whether he had designed these policies, whether he had signed these orders, whether he had built the system that crushed humanity for 300 years, he stood and looked at her with his cold Sithari eyes and said something that would follow him into history like a chain. They were useful. That is all they were ever meant to be. The silence that followed his words was not the confused silence of the day humanity left, nor the administrative silence of a council pretending nothing was wrong. It was the silence of 40 species realizing, all at once and all together, that the monster in the room was not hiding under the floor or behind the walls. It had been sitting in the highest seat the entire time. 2 years after the departure, the Council sent ships to find humanity, And what those ships found was somehow worse than finding nothing at all. The first expedition reached the colony world of New Kyoto, a planet that had once been home to 4 million humans, a world of terraced farms and paper lanterns and coastal cities, where children ran barefoot through markets that smelled of ginger and salt. And what the expedition found when they landed was silence and grass. The cities were gone. Not destroyed, not bombed, not burned, not crumbling in the way that abandoned places crumble when time and weather work together to pull them apart. No, the cities had been taken down, carefully, methodically, brick by brick and beam by beam, as if every building had been a guest in someone's home and had been politely asked to leave and had done so without complaint. The streets had been pulled up and the soil beneath them had been restored. The foundations had been filled and planted over. The power lines had been removed and the poles taken down, and the holes they left behind had been filled with earth and seeded with wildflowers. And where 4 million people had once lived and laughed and built a life, there was now nothing but rolling green hills and the sound of wind moving through grass that had no memory of what stood there before. The expedition's captain, a Velocity officer named Thavin who had served alongside human colleagues for 20 years, stood in the middle of what had once been New Kyoto's central plaza and turned in a slow circle and felt something crack inside his chest that he did not have a word for. Every human world was the same. 14 colony planets, each one visited by a different council expedition, each one found in the same impossible condition. Every trace of human habitation removed with the care and precision of a surgeon closing a wound, every scar healed, every footprint erased, forests replanted where cities had stood, rivers restored to their original courses, oceans cleaned of every trace of industrial activity. And the land returned to a state so pristine that it looked as though no one had ever lived there at all. Humanity had not just left, they had undone themselves, taken apart their own history, packed up their existence and carried it away into the dark. And the message in that act was louder than any bomb could ever be, because it said we were here and we made this beautiful, and you did not deserve it, so we are taking it with us, and leaving you nothing to remember us by. The Council sent long-range probes beyond the galactic rim, into the vast empty space between the Orion Spur and the next spiral arm, a region that appeared on every star chart as a blank white void marked with the words uncharted, no strategic value. The kind of place that elder species ignored, because there was nothing there worth taking. The probes detected a signal. It was faint, buried in the background noise of the cosmos like a whisper in a hurricane, but it was unmistakably human in origin. A transmission using encoding protocols that Council cryptographers recognized but could not break, because the encryption was based on mathematical principles that human minds could navigate and no other species' technology could replicate. And every attempt to decode the signal produced nothing but static and the occasional fragment of what might have been music. The Orevan, the oldest telepathic species in Council space, the ones who could reach across light years and touch the surface of a mind the way a hand touches water, sent their 3 most powerful telepaths to the galactic edge in a specially shielded vessel, and the telepaths sat in their dark chamber and reached out into the void and searched for the familiar frequency of human thought. What they found made one of them weep and another fall silent for 6 days. They reported sensing billions of human minds, not scattered, not fleeing, not hiding in fear, but gathered together in a concentration of consciousness so dense and so calm that it felt like standing at the edge of an ocean, and realizing that the ocean was thinking, and the thoughts were not angry and not sad and not vengeful, but simply, impossibly, at peace. The eldest telepath, a being named Orochi who had lived for 3,000 years and had touched the minds of every known species in the galaxy, described it in words that would later be carved into the wall of the Grand Assembly. They are not hiding, they simply do not wish to be found, and they are building something. Something I cannot see but can feel the way you feel the warmth of a fire through a closed door. And whatever it is, It is extraordinary. 3 weeks after the telepaths returned, a single automated relay station activated near the border of Council space. A small, unremarkable device that no one remembered being placed there, floating in the dark between two dying stars, and it broadcast one message on a loop in every known galactic language. The same words repeated again and again in the calm, measured, unmistakably human cadence that the galaxy had once heard every day and never appreciated. "We bear you no malice. We wish you well. Please do not follow." The message played for exactly 24 hours, and then the relay station powered down and went dark, and no amount of effort could reactivate it. And the silence that followed felt like a door being gently but firmly closed. Council space continued to die. 2 border wars erupted in the Navian corridor within the same month. The Tanori and the Selkith, species who had shared a trade route for 800 years without a single armed conflict, began shooting at each other over a mining rights dispute that a human mediator could have resolved in an afternoon with coffee and patience. And by the time the Council managed to intervene, 14 ships had been destroyed and 2,000 beings were dead. The Kethvori lost an entire generation to the gray wasting. The young ones, the ones born after the human antivirals stopped being manufactured, their hollow bones dissolving inside them before they reached their first century, and the Kethvori elders who had to watch their children die, carried a grief so heavy that several of them simply stopped eating and let themselves fade, because living for thousands of years is only bearable when there is a future worth living for. The Drith starvation riots were the worst violence the collective had experienced in its recorded history. Hive queens fighting over dwindling food stores, worker castes breaking their genetic programming to steal from neighboring colonies, larvae left unfed in abandoned nurseries, and the buzzing that had once been the sound of a thriving civilization became the sound of something tearing itself apart from the inside. And through it all, the galaxy kept turning, and the stars kept burning, and the empty space beyond the rim kept its secrets, and the silence where humanity used to be grew louder every day until it was the loudest thing in the universe. Valith Tharan was removed from power quietly, without ceremony, by his own people. The Sithari Dominion, which had once been the proudest and most powerful voice in the Council, could no longer afford the luxury of arrogance when their own trade networks were collapsing, and their own colonies were going hungry. And Tharan, who had built his entire career on the certainty that some species were born to rule and others were born to serve, found himself alone in a small apartment on a minor Sithari world with no visitors and no allies, and no one who wanted to hear him speak. He died 3 months later. The official cause was listed as a cardiac event, but those who knew him said he simply ran out of reasons to keep his heart beating, and his last recorded words, spoken to an empty room in the middle of the night, were a curse against humanity that was also, if you listened closely enough, an admission of something he had spent his entire life refusing to feel. Iluni addressed what remained of the Council, 19 species now, less than half of what it had been, in a chamber that felt too large for the bodies it contained, and her light was dim with exhaustion and grief, but her voice was steady, and her words were the truest thing anyone in that room had heard in a very long time. "We did not lose a tool," she said, and her gaze moved across every face in the chamber. "We lost the only species that ever believed this union could be more than a hierarchy. They came to us with open hands, and we filled those hands with our work and our problems and our contempt, and they carried all of it without complaint because they believed, truly, genuinely believed, that one day we would see them as they were, and we never did, and now they are gone, and the tragedy is not that they left. The tragedy is that they were right to leave, and we are the ones who made it so." No one applauded. No one disagreed. And somewhere beyond the rim, in a place the Council could not reach and could not see and could not understand, humanity continued to build, and their silence was not a punishment and not a weapon and not a statement. It was simply the sound of a people who had finally stopped waiting for permission to be free. 5 years after humanity walked out of the Grand Assembly, Thessinus Prime was a ghost wearing the skin of a palace, half its corridors dark, half its systems running on backup power that nobody knew how to maintain, and the great crystalline ceiling of the assembly chamber had developed a crack that ran from one end to the other like a scar on the face of something that had once been beautiful. 19 species remained, and even among those 19, the word council was spoken with the same tone people use when referring to a relative who is dying and everyone knows it, but nobody wants to say it out loud. Iluni had not slept properly in 3 years' sleep, for an Oravan meant dimming the light of consciousness and allowing the mind to drift in the warm current of shared telepathic dreaming. But there was no warmth left in the currents of Thessinus Prime, only the cold static of failing systems and the low, persistent hum of grief that radiated from every species, still present like heat from a dying fire. She was sitting alone in her chambers, reviewing yet another crisis report, this one about a water shortage on a Velisi colony that had once been a paradise and was now a slowly poisoning trap, when her communication array activated on a frequency she did not recognize. The signal was old, impossibly old, using protocols that predated the council itself, a language of mathematics and light that had not been spoken in known space for longer than most civilizations had existed. And when Iluni's systems finally translated it, the message was simple. "We have been watching, we would like to speak." The sender identified themselves as the Gale. Every species in council space knew the name, the way every child knows the name of a figure from legend. The Gale were the ancients, the first starfarers, the species that had been old when the universe was young, and they had vanished from the galactic record so long ago that most scholars classified them as mythological, a story that species told each other to explain the ruins and artifacts found on dead worlds at the edges of mapped space. They were not mythological. They were simply somewhere else, and they had been watching the council the way an old teacher watches a student repeat the same mistake year after year after year, with a patience that was indistinguishable from sadness. The Gale sent a single representative, or rather, the Gale sent a projection, a shimmering figure of silver light that appeared in the center of the assembly chamber and stood where Lyra Osa had once stood, and where Valith Tharin had once laughed, and the figure looked at the 19 remaining delegations with eyes that had seen the birth of stars, and said what it had come to say. "Humanity is not the first." The words fell into the chamber like stones into still water, and the ripples they created would never stop spreading. The Gale explained, and as they explained, the history of the galaxy rearranged itself into a pattern that was as clear as it was horrifying. Every few thousand years, a young species emerged, bright, empathetic, full of the irrational hope that defines beings who have not yet learned to be cynical. And that species joined the council and offered its gifts freely. And the council took those gifts and used that species and ground it down, and denied it dignity and told itself that this was the natural order of things, that some were born to lead and others were born to serve. And eventually, every single time the young species left. 11 times this had happened. 11 bright and generous civilizations that had poured their hearts into a union that refused to love them back. And 11 times the council had watched them go and told itself that the loss did not matter, and then spent centuries dealing with the consequences of a lie it could not stop telling. The Gale themselves had been the very first species to join a governing body that had existed before the current council, a predecessor organization that had treated them exactly the way the council treated humanity. And when the Gale left, that predecessor organization collapsed and was eventually replaced by the council, which learned nothing from the wreckage it was built on. "You are a wheel," the Gale projection said, and its voice was not angry but carried the weight of someone who had watched a tragedy repeat itself so many times that the tragedy had become a kind of law. "You turn and turn and turn, and you crush the same people under the same part of the rim, and you call it progress because the wheel is still moving. But you are going nowhere. You have always been going nowhere." Then the Gale told them about the conquered. Humanity had not wandered into the void alone. They had been met, beyond the rim, by the other 10 departed species, civilizations that had left the Council across thousands of years, and had found each other in the vast spaces between the spiral arms, drawn together by the shared experience of having once believed in something that did not believe in them. Together, these 11 species, including humanity, including the Gale, had built something new, an alliance founded not on hierarchy or power or the ancient assumption that age equals wisdom, but on the simple and revolutionary principle that every species deserved to be treated the way it treated others. They called it the Conquered, and it was already larger than the Council had ever been, not larger in territory or military strength, but larger in the way that mattered, larger in cooperation, in shared research, in mutual aid, in the thousand small acts of trust that turn a collection of strangers into a family. The Gale projection looked at the 19 remaining delegations and offered them a choice. Reform, completely, honestly, without reservation or excuse, and petition the conquered for reconciliation, opening a dialogue that would take years and require the kind of humility that the Council had never shown in its entire history. Or remain as they were, and watch the center of galactic civilization shift permanently beyond the rim, and fade into irrelevance on a dying station under a cracked ceiling. The projection vanished, and the chamber sat in a silence that was not empty but full of the weight of 10,000 years of mistakes, and the fragile, terrifying possibility that it was not too late to make a different choice. Iluni did not wait for a vote. She sat down that night and began to write what she called the Letter of Accountability, a document that had never existed in Council history, because the Council had never once in 10,000 years admitted to being wrong about anything, and the act of writing it was like breaking a bone that had healed crooked and setting it straight, painful and necessary and long overdue. The letter named every wrong, not in the language of diplomacy that softened edges and hid truths behind comfortable words, but in plain language that anyone could understand. We denied you your rights. We stole your work. We silenced your culture. We sent your children to die in wars that were not theirs. We took your greatest invention and gave credit to those who did nothing. We ignored your pleas for 300 years, and when you finally left, we celebrated. We were wrong. We are sorry. We do not ask for forgiveness because we have not yet earned it, but we ask for the chance to begin. The letter was signed by every remaining delegation, some with hesitation, some with shame, some with the quiet relief of beings who had been carrying a secret they could finally put down, and it was transmitted toward the rim on every frequency humanity had ever used, aimed at the silence, aimed at the void, aimed at the hope that someone on the other side was still listening. Weeks passed. The crack in the ceiling of the assembly chamber grew longer, and the backup systems flickered more frequently, and the 19 species waited with the anxious patience of someone who has knocked on a door and does not know if anyone is home. Then a response arrived. It did not come from a government or a president or an ambassador or a military commander. It came from a small school on a colony world beyond the rim, a place that had no name in any council database, and the response was a recording made by a classroom of human children who looked no older than 8 or 9 years old. The recording was shaky, filmed on a handheld device by someone with small hands, and it showed a classroom with bright walls covered in drawings of stars and alien species, including, Iluni noticed with a feeling she could not name, drawings of Oravan and Sithari and Velisi and Kethvori, drawn with the clumsy affection of children who had never met these species but had been taught about them with kindness. A girl with dark braids and a gap-toothed smile stood in front of the class and spoke in a voice that was clear and bright, and carried the accent of a world that had never known the inside of a council chamber. We learned about you in history class. Our teacher says you are trying to be better. We hope so. You are welcome to visit sometime." The other children waved at the camera, and some of them held up their drawings, and one small boy in the back row was picking his nose, and another girl was making a face at her friend. And it was messy and imperfect, and so thoroughly, impossibly, beautifully human that Iluni, who had lived for 4,000 years, and had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, and had carried the grief of an entire galaxy on her shoulders for 5 years, sat in her chair in the dim light of the assembly chamber and wept. Not from sadness, not from guilt, not from relief, but from the shattering, overwhelming recognition that this species, this small, stubborn, infuriating, generous, impossible species that the Council had spent 300 years trying to diminish, had every reason in the universe to hate them and had chosen not to. Had chosen, even now, even after everything, to leave the door open. Had chosen to teach their children about the species that wronged them not with bitterness, but with crayons and curiosity, and the radical, defiant, unbreakable belief that people can change. The Council's first ship crossed the galactic rim on a morning that no calendar would record, because it was not the kind of event that belonged in official histories. It was smaller than that and larger than that. A single vessel carrying no weapons and no demands and no flags, just a letter and 19 species worth of hope and the willingness, at long last, to arrive not as rulers or conquerors or even equals, but as guests. As the ship crossed the invisible line where Council space ended and the unknown began, Iluni stood at the observation window and watched the stars change, not in color or brightness but in meaning, because these were not her stars, not the stars she had been taught to own, but the stars that someone else had chosen as home, and she was entering them with nothing but the hope that she might, after 10,000 years of getting it wrong, finally be worthy of the welcome that humanity had once offered freely, and the galaxy had been too proud to accept. Behind her, the cracked ceiling of Thessanis Prime grew dark as the last lights went out. Ahead of her, somewhere in the uncharted void, a classroom full of children was waiting to show their drawings to the stars. And for the first time in a very long time, the galaxy moved not in a circle but forward,